People say your life flashes before your eyes when you die, but as my chest was crushed and blood soaked the stretcher, I only saw my husband desperately begging the clinic surgeon to save his business partner from a panic attack. He chose to let me suffocate. I used my last ounce of strength to sign my own surgery consent. By the time he remembered his wife, I was gone, taking the only key to his entire empire. Hello to all our wonderful listeners at Violet Revenge Stories. We are sad to share that YouTube has completely demonetized our channel, leaving us with zero budget to keep operating and compensating our hardworking team. If you find today's story captivating, please consider supporting us with just $1 so our staff can cover their living expenses and continue creating the content you love. You can easily support us by scanning the QR code on your screen or by clicking the donation link in the description or the comments. My name is Harper Ward. I am the Chief Engineer of AeroBuild Innovations, and the night I realized my marriage was nothing but a hollow lie was the exact same night I almost died in a twisted pile of steel and snow. The blizzard came out of nowhere, swallowing the highway in a blinding sheet of white just as we were driving back from the annual corporate awards gala. 1 second, the heater was humming against the freezing winter air, and the next, a catastrophic multi-car pileup tore our vehicle apart. The impact was deafening. The frame of our luxury sedan crumpled like a discarded soda can, pinning me instantly under the crushing weight of the dashboard. I remember the immediate, suffocating pressure in my chest. My ribs had splintered inward, and my lungs were rapidly filling with fluid, plunging me into a life-threatening pleural effusion. Every desperate gasp for air felt like swallowing shards of glass, tearing my insides apart with a white-hot agony. Right beside me in the wreckage was Serena Sterling, a shareholder and the primary business partner of my husband, Julian Vance. Serena was relatively unscathed. A single, jagged piece of glass had embedded itself superficially into her shoulder. It was a minor wound, yet she was spiraling into a massive, screaming panic attack, thrashing and wailing as if her limbs were being severed. We were both dragged out of the freezing carnage and rushed to a severely overloaded county clinic. The small medical center was sheer chaos. Fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting a sickly yellow glow over the crowded hallways filled with groaning victims and frantic nurses. The smell of copper blood and cheap antiseptic hung heavy in the stifling air. They placed Serena and me on adjacent stretchers in the trauma bay. I could not speak. The fluid in my chest cavity was drowning me from the inside out, turning my lips a bruised, violent shade of blue. My vision blurred at the edges, tunneling into a dark abyss, but my hearing remained agonizingly sharp. Because Serena was an orphan and had legally designated Julian as her emergency medical proxy, my husband had the authority to sign her treatment papers, and he did. He did not run to his bleeding, suffocating wife. Julian rushed directly to Serena. Through the fading edges of my consciousness, I watched the man I had loved and supported for 5 long years grip the clinic surgeon by the collar. Julian was frantic, completely losing his mind over a woman who was merely hyperventilating from fear, while I was actively suffocating to death less than 10 feet away. "You have to calm her down," Julian shouted, his voice cracking with a raw, desperate emotion I had rarely seen him direct at me. "Give her whatever she needs." A panicked triage nurse sprinted toward Julian, waving a crumpled clipboard in his face. She pointed frantically at my stretcher, her voice shrill with terror. "Sir, your wife is in acute respiratory failure. We need your signature right now for an emergency thoracotomy, or she is going to die on this table." I forced my eyes open, clinging to a desperate, foolish shred of hope. I thought he would turn around. I thought he would drop everything and run to me. Instead, Julian aggressively shoved the nurse away. He did not even glance in my direction. "Harper is a strong person. She can handle it," Julian yelled back, his eyes entirely fixed on the weeping woman on the next bed. "Serena's heart rate is out of control. Save Serena first." The absolute silence that fell over my soul in that moment was colder than the blizzard outside. The air continued to leave my collapsing lungs, But the physical agony was entirely eclipsed by the shattering realization of my reality. 5 years of unwavering loyalty, 5 years of being his rock, his quiet supporter, the foundation upon which he built his pathetic ego. All of it dissolved into a bitter, silent chuckle that sent fresh blood bubbling up the back of my throat. I understood then. I had always been the capable one, the one who could endure. And because of that, I was entirely expendable. The nurse looked horrified, staring at Julian in disbelief before rushing back to my side. She tried to grab my wrist to check my fading pulse, her hands shaking. I pulled my arm away. I refused her pity. I refused to let my life end waiting for a man who had already chosen to let me die. My right hand was badly crushed, the skin torn and slick with my own blood. Every slight movement sent blinding shockwaves of agony radiating up my arm and straight into my spine, but a sudden, icy surge of adrenaline flooded my veins. With agonizing slowness, I reached out and snatched the pen from the nurse's trembling fingers. I dragged the clipboard onto my chest. My breathing was nothing but a wet, shallow rattle now, using every remaining ounce of willpower I possessed. I pressed the pen to the life-or-death consent form. I smeared my own blood across the cheap paper as I forced my shattered fingers to spell out my name. I signed for my own life. The medical team immediately swarmed my stretcher, shouting orders as they prepped the heavy doses of anesthesia. The edges of the room began to melt into darkness as the drugs flooded my system. But before I went under, I reached across with my bloody fingers and gripped the diamond wedding band on my left hand. The metal felt heavy, suffocating, and entirely foreign. I twisted it off my finger, tearing the skin, and tossed it into a rusty surgical tray beside my bed. The ring hit the metal with a hollow, meaningless clink. As my eyes finally closed and the darkness pulled me under, the last thought that anchored my soul to the living world was a quiet, unbreakable vow. If I wake up from this, Julian Vance will be nothing more than a dead name. The harsh glare of the fluorescent recovery room lights sliced through the lingering fog of anesthesia. I opened my eyes. There was no disorientation, no frantic grasping for a comforting hand. The fiery agony radiating from my stitched chest was a sharp, clinical reminder that I had survived. I did not shed a single tear. The woman who might have wept for her absent husband had died on that bloody stretcher. In her place, a cold, calculating clarity settled over my mind, sharp as a surgical blade. I turned my head slightly, ignoring the throbbing pain in my neck, and locked eyes with a young nurse who was checking my intravenous drip. "My phone," I rasped, my voice barely more than a dry whisper. "I need my phone." She hesitated, glancing at the heavy bandages wrapping my torso, but the look in my eyes left absolutely no room for debate. She retrieved my shattered but functional device from a plastic evidence bag. My fingers were heavily splinted and throbbing with a dull ache, but I managed to unlock the screen. I bypassed my personal contacts entirely, opening a highly encrypted application buried deep within my system folders. I tapped a sequence of commands and initiated a direct, untraceable line to the Global Security Director of AeroBuild Innovations. The line clicked open instantly. "This is Harper Ward," I said, my voice steady despite the searing pain in my lungs. "I am initiating a Level 1 emergency extraction. Medical support required. Secure my location through my global positioning signal. I need immediate corporate shielding." "Understood. Chief Engineer, we are mobilizing," came the crisp, professional reply. Less than 3 hours later, the chaotic hum of the rural clinic was drowned out by the deafening roar of twin rotor blades. The building practically shook as an elite, heavily armed private medical team from AeroBuild touched down on the snow-covered parking lot. They swept into the facility like a shadow, moving with a brutal, synchronized efficiency that made the local staff freeze in their tracks. They wore unmarked black tactical gear over advanced medical scrubs. There were no questions asked, no permissions sought. While 2 trauma specialists flawlessly transferred my monitors to their portable, state-of-the-art equipment, a pair of corporate fixers marched straight into the records department. Within minutes, every single digital and physical trace of my medical file was seized. encrypted and locked down behind AeroBuild's impenetrable corporate firewall to the outside world, and specifically to anyone asking questions at that clinic. My presence there had simply been erased. I was wheeled out into the freezing night air, the biting wind whipping across my face, and loaded into the back of the medical transport chopper. Before the heavy doors slid shut, the lead security officer handed me a secure tablet containing the live feed from a covert operative left behind in the clinic lobby. I watched the glowing screen with absolute detachment as the scene played out exactly as I had anticipated. After spending hours coddling Serena until she finally drifted into a medicated sleep, Julian must have suddenly remembered he had a wife. The hidden footage showed him striding back into the trauma ward, looking mildly inconvenienced rather than frantic. He pushed past a privacy curtain, expecting to find me waiting for his hollow apologies. Instead, he found a perfectly stripped, empty bed. The camera zoomed in on the surgical tray beside the mattress. Sitting right in the center, gleaming under the harsh overhead lights, was my diamond wedding band, crusted in dried, brown blood. I watched Julian's face contort from confusion into absolute, unhinged rage. He stormed out into the hallway, grabbing the exhausted clinic director by the shoulders, screaming demands about where his wife had been taken. He threatened lawsuits. He threatened to buy the hospital and fire everyone, completely losing his carefully curated gentleman persona. His tirade was abruptly cut short when a man in a bespoke charcoal suit stepped smoothly out of the shadows. It was AeroBuild's senior litigation counsel. "Mr. Vance," the lawyer said, his voice dripping with absolute freezing authority. "Under the strict regulations of the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, this facility cannot confirm or deny the medical status of any patient. Furthermore, I am serving you with a temporary restraining order, effective immediately. You are legally barred from seeking contact with Harper Ward." Julian stood there, stunned into complete silence, the bloody ring clutched tightly in his trembling fist. High above the blizzard, in the sterile, humming cabin of the helicopter, I turned off the tablet. The medic beside me attempted to adjust my oxygen flow, but I waved him away. I asked him to hand me my encrypted engineering laptop for my recovered belongings. The pain in my chest was a constant, blinding fire, but my mind was operating at a terrifying speed. For 3 years, Julian had built his tech empire on a foundation of lies. The core software architecture his entire company relied upon did not belong to him. I had developed it. I owned the patents. I had quietly leased the intellectual property to his firm for a fraction of its true worth, playing the supportive wife behind the scenes so his fragile ego could take the spotlight. He thought he owned the kingdom, but he had merely been renting the throne. Typing slowly with my uninjured fingers, I bypassed the biometric locks and accessed the central mainframe of my private servers. The glowing lines of code reflected in my eyes. I located the master access keys that allowed Julian's servers to integrate with my proprietary algorithms. I did not hesitate. I did not feel a single ounce of pity. With one decisive strike of the Enter key, I executed the remote kill switch. I revoked every single license. I severed the digital tethers, locking his company completely out of the core technology that kept his business breathing. As the confirmation messages flooded my screen in rapid succession, marking the sudden death of his life's work, I leaned back against the medical stretcher. I closed my eyes, letting the rhythmic vibration of the helicopter carry me into the dark, completely at peace. The frantic manhunt Julian launched to find me had absolutely nothing to do with a guilty conscience. My corporate security team intercepted his desperate communications within 48 hours of my disappearance. He was not turning the city upside down because he missed his bleeding wife. He was tearing his hair out because his company was exactly 1 week away from finalizing a $2 billion corporate merger. The acquiring conglomerate had discovered the sudden software blackout and demanded an immediate, legally binding transfer of all core intellectual property. They required the primary patent holder to sign the final documents in person. That primary patent holder was me. Without my signature, his entire empire was completely worthless, and the massive acquisition would collapse like a house of cards. I monitored his digital panic from the confines of a top-secret, heavily guarded rehabilitation fortress tucked away on the rugged northern coastline. Outside my reinforced glass window, the ocean crashed violently against jagged rocks, a perfect reflection of the storm I was meticulously brewing indoors. My shattered ribs were tightly bound, and every breath was a calculated effort, but my mind had never been sharper. I sat at a massive oak table covered in encrypted laptops and towering stacks of financial documents. Surrounding me was a hand-picked team of ruthless forensic accountants and elite private investigators. We were dissecting my marriage piece by bleeding piece. The first horrifying truth surfaced when my lead accountant breached a web of offshore shell companies tied to Julian. I watched in cold silence as a labyrinth of wire transfers was projected onto the screen. Over the past 4 years, Julian had been systematically draining our joint emergency reserve funds. He bled our accounts dry, filtering the money through untraceable corporate expenses to purchase a sprawling, secluded mansion in the hills. The deed was heavily obscured behind a blind trust, but the primary resident listed on the utility bills was Serena Sterling. He had bought his mistress a luxury estate using the very money I had earned and saved to build our future family. But the financial betrayal was only the tip of the knife. The true psychological rot of their relationship was exposed when my lead investigator handed me a thick, stolen medical dossier. "We pulled her private psychiatric records," the investigator said, sliding the heavy file across the table. "You need to read the primary assessments." I opened the folder. My eyes scanned the confidential notes from 3 different high-priced therapists Serena had cycled through over the years. According to every single clinical evaluation, there was zero physiological or psychological evidence of a genuine panic disorder. The illness was a complete fabrication. Her hyperventilation, her dramatic collapses, her sudden inability to breathe whenever I was in the room, it was all a meticulously scripted performance. The records showed a chilling, documented pattern. Her severe episodes miraculously aligned with every single one of my wedding anniversaries, my birthday dinners, and any vacation Julian and I had ever attempted to take. She had weaponized a fake mental illness to keep Julian on a tight, emotional leash. She played the fragile, broken bird so perfectly that she completely rewired his brain, training him to drop everything, including his own wife. The moment she cried out, it was a masterclass in psychological manipulation, designed specifically to isolate me and render my presence in his life entirely irrelevant. While I sat in the sterile fortress building my case, Serena took her performance to the public stage. With the merger hanging by a thread and my whereabouts completely unknown, she launched a vicious, calculated smear campaign on social media. She posted carefully edited, black and white photos of herself sitting in a hospital waiting room, looking exhausted and traumatized. The captions were long, poetic essays about surviving near-fatal trauma and the devastating pain of abandonment. She never mentioned my name directly, but the implications were lethal. She painted a tragic picture of a cruel, blindly jealous spouse who heartlessly abandoned her husband and his traumatized business partner in their darkest, most vulnerable hour. She claimed they were left to pick up the broken pieces while dealing with severe post-traumatic stress. The internet swallowed the lie whole. Within a single day, her posts garnered hundreds of thousands of views and tens of thousands of enraged comments. Total strangers formed digital mobs, hunting for my profiles, demanding justice for the poor. Abandoned husband and his brave, suffering partner. They branded me a monster. They called for my absolute ruin. My public relations director begged me to release a statement to crush the narrative, but I raised my hand and silenced the room. I refused to write a single word of defense. I refused to correct the furious public. When you are hunting apex predators, you do not warn them that there is a sniper in the trees. You let them feast. You let them roar and beat their chests and believe they command the entire jungle. I let the public outrage boil over. I let Julian and Serena bathe in the toxic sympathy of strangers, feeling invincible in their shared lies. Beneath the surface of their temporary victory, my legal team and I were drafting a massive, inescapable lawsuit. This was no longer just about signing divorce papers. We were compiling enough hard evidence to trigger federal indictments for grand larceny, corporate fraud, and severe economic crimes. I watched Serena's follower count rise on the screen, a dark, satisfied smile curling on my lips. Let them climb to the absolute highest peak of their delusion. Let them build their throne on a mountain of public adoration and stolen wealth. Because the higher they fly into the sun, the more bones they will shatter when I finally drag them out of the sky. Exactly 7 days before the ink was supposed to dry on his $2 billion merger, the fragile illusion of Julian's control shattered entirely. My lead attorney did not send him a dramatic declaration of war. There were no bitter paragraphs detailing his emotional betrayal, no tearful accusations, and absolutely zero room for negotiation. Instead, a single, sterile email bypassed his executive assistant and landed directly in his private inbox at precisely 8 o'clock in the morning. Attached was a unilateral petition for divorce, citing irreconcilable differences and egregious financial misconduct. Below the petition was a brutal, uncompromising ultimatum. He was ordered to immediately remit $15 million in retroactive patent licensing fees, explicitly detailing how his firm had breached our contract by utilizing my proprietary code for unauthorized secondary projects. The intercepted server logs showed he opened the document 14 times in the span of 10 minutes. I could easily picture the exact color draining from his face as the sheer gravity of his impending ruin wrapped its icy fingers around his throat. Without that $15 million in liquid capital, and without my signature to validate the impending merger, his company was a dead entity walking. Panic is a highly predictable motivator, and under its crushing weight, Julian abandoned his carefully curated public image and went completely feral. He weaponized every single elite connection he had cultivated over the past decade, threatening board members and calling in massive favors to strong-arm AeroBuild Innovations into revealing my location. He demanded they hand over his wife. His frantic, desperate campaign abruptly slammed into a brick wall when the chief executive officer of AeroBuild personally answered his final, screaming phone call. Our corporate audio logs captured the exchange perfectly. Julian was shouting, demanding my immediate surrender, threatening massive defamation lawsuits. The chief executive let him finish his pathetic tantrum before delivering a fatal dose of reality. "Listen to me very carefully, Mr. Vance," the chief executive said, his voice dangerously low and resonant. "Harper Ward is not just an employee. She is the soul of our corporation. You messed with the wrong person. If you ever direct another threat at this firm, our legal division will ensure your entire bloodline regrets it." While Julian was desperately slamming his head against impenetrable corporate shields, Serena was watching her stolen kingdom crumble from the inside. The prospect of Julian declaring bankruptcy terrified her far more than the thought of losing the man himself. If he went down, her secret mansion, her limitless credit cards, and her lavish lifestyle evaporated into thin air. Fear makes greedy people incredibly stupid, acting entirely behind Julian's back. Serena initiated an offshore wire transfer using stolen corporate funds. Our cybersecurity team flagged the anomaly immediately. She was funneling hundreds of thousands of dollars to an anonymous black market syndicate, explicitly hiring cyber mercenaries to brute force their way through my encrypted servers. Her goal was to steal the master patent source code and forge my digital signature to push the merger through. She thought she was being a cunning survivor. In reality, she had just handed my forensic investigators a beautifully wrapped, undeniable felony charge. She walked right into a digital sandbox our engineers had designed specifically to trap intruders, logging her every keystroke and tracing the funds directly back to her personal accounts. It was the ultimate, fatal piece of criminal evidence I needed to lock her in a federal penitentiary for a very long time, oblivious to his mistress committing severe corporate espionage under his own roof. Julian completely unraveled. The absolute silence from my end was driving him insane. My encrypted burner phone began lighting up with an endless barrage of notifications. Hundreds of desperate text messages flooded my screen in rapid succession. the man who had callously left me to drown in my own blood was now begging on his digital knees. The messages shifted wildly from angry demands to pathetic, groveling apologies. He promised he would fire Serena immediately. He swore he would kick her out of his life entirely and sell the company so we could start over on a clean slate. He invoked the sacred bond of our marital affection, pleading with me to remember the early days of our relationship when we had nothing but each other. He told me he was lost without my guidance, that he was merely a foolish man who had made a terrible mistake in a moment of panic. I sat on the balcony of the secure facility, the cold ocean breeze sweeping through my hair, and watched his pathetic words scroll across the glowing glass. He truly believed I was still the same obedient, forgiving woman he had married. He thought my silence was hesitation, a sign that my heart was breaking and that I just needed the right combination of empty promises to come running back to fix his catastrophic mess. I let him sweat for another 12 hours, pushing his anxiety to the absolute breaking point. Finally, when the digital silence had thoroughly hollowed out his sanity, I typed out a single, precise response. I will come to the merger press conference. Prepare the papers. I hit send and tossed the burner phone onto the table. Through the covert surveillance feeds our operatives had planted in his office lobby, we watched Julian read the message. He collapsed back into his leather chair, burying his face in his hands as a massive, shuddering sigh of relief escaped his lungs. He truly believed he had won. He was absolutely convinced that his quiet, submissive wife had finally softened and was returning to save his life. He had no idea he was merely preparing the stage for his own public execution. The morning of the highly anticipated merger press conference arrived with a crisp, freezing clarity. The grand ballroom of the city's most opulent financial district hotel had been transformed into a glittering theater of corporate triumph. Hundreds of prominent journalists, industry analysts, and major international shareholders packed the cavernous space. Crystal chandeliers cast a dazzling, expensive glow over the massive stage, where a giant digital banner proudly announced the $2 billion union. Standing center stage, bathing in the incessant flashing of camera lenses, were Julian and Serena. They were dressed to absolute perfection. Julian wore a flawless midnight blue bespoke tuxedo that projected the image of a seasoned, victorious chief executive. Serena stood close by his side in a stunning pearl-white designer gown that was meant to evoke an aura of pure, innocent survival. They were putting on the performance of a lifetime, playing the heroic. Resilient entrepreneurs who had tragically braved a horrific accident and survived to conquer the tech industry. They smiled gracefully, accepting early congratulations from the front-row executives, completely oblivious to the executioner walking through the back doors. I did not arrive in a wheelchair. I refused to let them see even a shadow of the broken woman they had left to die in that freezing clinic. Instead, I wore a tailored, razor-sharp black velvet power suit that felt more like armor than clothing. My fractured ribs were tightly bound beneath the silk lining, and every step required immense physical discipline, but I walked under my own power. My right hand, still bearing the faint, healing scars of the steering wheel crush, gripped the handle of a sleek, silver-tipped walking cane. I moved with the slow, deliberate, and terrifying grace of an apex predator stepping into a cage of oblivious prey. I was no longer the quiet, supportive wife working in the shadows. I was the chief engineer of the most powerful technology firm in the country, and I owned every single breath in that room. As I made my way down the center aisle, the low hum of the crowd began to ripple and fade. The journalists turned their heavy camera lenses toward me. A heavy, suffocating silence swept over the grand ballroom. The sea of tailored suits parted respectfully, granting me a clear, unimpeded path directly to the stage. Julian looked up. His perfectly rehearsed smile froze on his face, quickly replaced by an expression of overwhelming, euphoric relief. He truly thought his salvation had finally arrived. He practically bounded off the stage, throwing his arms wide open for the cameras, ready to perform a passionate, tearful reunion for the national press. "Harper, my God, you are here!" Julian projected his voice loudly to ensure the television microphones caught his fake devotion. I did not break my stride, but I raised my chin exactly one fraction of an inch. Instantly, two towering men in identical charcoal suits stepped out from behind me. They were AeroBuild's elite personal security contractors. They moved with frightening speed, intercepting Julian mid-stride and aggressively planting their hands against his chest, forcing him to a sudden halt exactly 10 feet away from me. The cameras went absolutely wild. Shutters clicked furiously as Julian stumbled backward, his face flushing crimson with unexpected public humiliation. Serena gasped loudly, clutching the fabric of her white gown, desperately trying to salvage her fragile victim persona. But the journalists were no longer paying her any attention. All eyes in the ballroom were locked entirely on me. I ignored my husband completely. I bypassed the bewildered executives waiting eagerly with the leather-bound merger documents and walked straight up the short flight of stairs to the main podium. I adjusted the microphone, leaning heavily on my silver cane. I reached into my pocket, pulled out a small, encrypted black flash drive, and calmly slotted it into the main projector terminal. The room held its collective breath. Julian watched me, his chest heaving, his eyes pleading silently for me to sign his salvation and secure his fortune. I leaned into the microphone. My voice echoed through the massive ballroom, sharp, cold, and entirely devoid of mercy. "Good morning," I began, the sound cutting through the tense silence like a surgical scalpel. "I know many of you are expecting me to validate the transfer of my proprietary intellectual property to facilitate this massive financial acquisition today. However, I did not come here to sign a merger. I came here to officially announce the permanent, immediate revocation of every single technology license keeping this fraudulent company alive." A massive shockwave of gasps erupted from the shareholders sitting in the front row. The lead investor dropped his pen. Julian's jaw fell open, his face rapidly turning the color of wet ash. Serena let out a sharp cry, taking a terrified step backward as if she had been physically struck. "Before the financial regulators completely dismantle this firm," I continued, my voice perfectly steady and dominant over the rising chaos, "I believe the public deserves to know the true nature of the leadership you have been glorifying all week." I tapped the podium interface. The giant digital screen behind me flickered. The $2 billion merger logo vanished instantly, replaced by high-resolution scans of official, verified medical documentation from the night of the blizzard. I displayed the clinical triage report side by side. On the left was my personal record, detailing a catastrophic, life-threatening, collapsed lung and severe internal bleeding that required immediate surgical intervention. On the right was Serena's highly publicized file, explicitly listing a minor, superficial scratch from a piece of glass and a completely fabricated panic attack. The absolute silence in the room morphed into a dangerous, buzzing hive of furious whispers. I tapped the interface one more time. The audio file my private investigators had covertly recovered from the rural clinic's security system blasted through the state-of-the-art surround sound speakers. Julian's frantic, aggressive voice filled the ballroom, loud and perfectly clear for every single journalist to record. "Harper is a strong person. She can handle it. Serena's heart rate is out of control. Save Serena first." The impact was instantaneous and utterly devastating. The wealthy executives who had just been shaking Julian's hand practically recoiled in physical disgust. The reporters began shouting over each other, demanding answers, thrusting their recording devices toward the stage. The tragic narrative Serena had so carefully constructed on social media shattered into a million irreparable pieces right in front of their eyes. They were no longer the brave heroes of a winter storm. They were publicly exposed as a callous, deceitful fraud and his pathetic, manipulative mistress. Julian was shaking uncontrollably, trapped like a caged animal behind my security detail, staring up at the giant screen as his entire carefully constructed universe burned to the ground in real time. I stood perfectly still at the podium, gripping the cold silver head of my cane. I looked down at the two of them shivering in the magnificent wreckage of their own making. A slow, terrifyingly cold smile curled the corners of my lips. I watched their panic reach its absolute peak, knowing deep in my bones that destroying their public image and tanking their company was merely the appetizer. They thought the nightmare was over, but I was just unlatching the gates to hell. The outrage in the grand ballroom was absolutely deafening, but I was not finished. I did not give the screaming reporters or the furious executives a single second to catch their breath. I tapped the podium console a third time. The medical records vanished from the massive screen, instantly replaced by a complex, damning web of offshore bank accounts and heavily redacted wire transfers. If you thought severe moral bankruptcy was their only offense, I announced, my voice slicing effortlessly through the chaotic uproar, allow me to present the undeniable proof of their federal crimes. I triggered the next audio file. This time, it was not Julian speaking, it was Serena. Her panicked, frantic voice echoed across the room, desperately negotiating with an anonymous underground broker. The crowd listened in absolute, stunned horror as she explicitly offered hundreds of thousands of dollars in stolen corporate funds to hire cyber mercenaries. They heard her clearly demanding the hackers breach AeroBuild Innovations, steal my proprietary source code, and forge my digital signature to illegally force the merger through. Serena let out a blood-curdling shriek. She lunged forward, desperately trying to reach the audio cables, but my security contractors shoved her back effortlessly. I pointed my silver cane at the towering digital screen. While she was busy committing corporate espionage, my husband was diligently embezzling from his own company and our joint marital assets. Those highlighted ledgers prove that he siphoned millions of dollars into a blind trust to purchase a luxury estate for his mistress. He funded his pathetic double life using the very capital required to keep this company afloat. And just to be completely transparent with the shareholders in the room today, the Federal Bureau of Investigation has been reviewing these exact files since 6 o'clock this morning. Federal arrest warrants for grand larceny, wire fraud, and severe economic sabotage were officially authorized exactly 1 hour ago. The entire ballroom completely exploded. The lead investor of the acquiring conglomerate, a ruthless billionaire who had been singing Julian's praises just 20 minutes earlier, leaped out of his front row seat. His face was a mask of pure, unadulterated fury. He pointed a trembling finger directly at the stage. "This deal is dead," he roared over the chaotic din of the flashing cameras. "The merger is completely voided. We will sue you and this entire fraudulent shell of a company for billions of dollars in punitive damages." As if on cue, the giant livestock ticker running along the upper balcony of the ballroom began to violently flash red. The financial world was watching the broadcast in real time. Within seconds, the corporate shares began a catastrophic freefall. 10%, 40%, 60%. I watched with immense, chilling satisfaction as 80% of Julian's entire net worth evaporated into thin air right in front of his eyes. Seeing the empire completely disintegrate, the fragile, innocent mask Serena had worn for years violently peeled away. The delicate, traumatized victim vanished, replaced by a vicious, cornered rat. She spun around and launched herself at Julian. She clawed frantically at his bespoke tuxedo, her face contorted in absolute rage. "You told me we were safe!" she screamed hysterically, completely ignoring the dozens of television cameras broadcasting her meltdown to the entire nation. "You said you had it under control. You forced me to do this. You ruined my life. You pathetic loser." The two lovers, who had sworn undying devotion to each other, were now viciously tearing each other apart on a public stage. Julian violently shoved her away, his eyes wide with a manic, unhinged terror. He was completely broken. The arrogant chief executive was gone. He collapsed heavily onto his knees right in the center of the stage. He crawled past the podium, tears streaming down his face, and desperately grabbed the bottom of my silver walking cane. "Harper, please," he wailed, his voice a pathetic, sobbing mess. "I was wrong. I'm so sorry. I truly love you. Harper, I was just blinded by the stress. I did not know what I was doing. Please, you are the only one who can fix this. You have to save me." The entire ballroom fell into a sudden, tense hush as everyone waited to see what the betrayed wife would do. I looked down at the man sobbing at my feet. I felt absolutely nothing, no anger, no sorrow, only the cold, sterile satisfaction of a surgeon successfully excising a rotting tumor. I leaned down slightly, bringing my face closer to the microphone so that my final words would be permanently etched into his memory and broadcasted across the globe. "Julian," I said, my voice as sharp and unforgiving as a scalpel, "you do not love me. You just love the way I have always cleaned up the catastrophic messes you leave behind. But right now, my doctor has given me very strict medical orders. He explicitly warned me that filthy garbage is highly likely to cause severe infections in my surgical stitches." Julian gasped, his eyes widening in absolute horror as the finality of my words struck him. I violently yanked my cane out of his desperate grasp. He fell forward, his face slamming into the polished wooden floor. I turned to the executive table beside the podium. Lying right on top of the ruined merger contracts was the unilateral divorce petition I had prepared. I picked up a heavy gold pen and signed my name with a swift, brutal stroke. I dropped the pen. I did not look back at him. I did not look at Serena, who was now sobbing hysterically in the corner. As I slowly walked down the stairs and headed toward the exit, the heavy, unmistakable wail of police sirens began to echo loudly outside the hotel's glass doors. Flashing red and blue lights painted the ballroom walls. I pushed through the double doors and stepped out into the freezing, bracing winter air. This time, I was not bleeding on a stretcher. I was not running away from the shadow of death. I was walking proudly, unburdened, and entirely free, stepping firmly toward an empire that belonged solely to me. To all of our amazing listeners tuning in today, thank you so sincerely from the bottom of my heart for staying with us until the very end of this incredible journey. We would love to know where in the world you are listening from, so please share your city or country in the comments below. If you enjoyed today's story and felt the satisfaction of this ultimate revenge, please consider helping our channel survive. As we mentioned, YouTube has cut off our monetization, and our dedicated team relies entirely on your generosity to pay our staff so they can feed their families and keep creating better stories to serve you. A contribution of just $1 makes a massive difference. You can support us easily by scanning the quick response code currently on your screen, or by clicking the donation link provided in the video description and the pinned comment. Thank you again for your kindness, and we will see you in the next story.